Hello and welcome. You are listening to an informed take on current events brought to you by law students and staff of Queen's University Belfast. This is LawPod.
In this special edition of LawPod, I'm joined by Dr. Ian Fry, a senior lecturer at the Australian National University and veteran representative of the Pacific island of Tuvalu at international climate change negotiations. In the episode, we take a deep dive into the issues addressed at COP26 in Glasgow and survey the state of international climate diplomacy. The small island states are often cast as the conscience of UN climate negotiations, and for good reason. They are often represented by the most experienced and passionate of diplomats. Ian Fry, whose forebears have origins here in Northern Ireland, has championed the cause of the small island states and the least developed for 25 years. In 2009, he brought proceedings at the ill-fated Copenhagen COP to a halt with one of the most memorable interventions ever witnessed during UN negotiations. Ian, welcome to the Law School podcast. Delighted to see you. I thought it would be nice to begin with an introduction to your own biography, but it's a biography that's very closely tied up with the climate change negotiation processes going back some years now. So maybe you could introduce yourself and give us a taste of your interventions and role in the negotiations.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be on. So I basically started in this sort of climate change process back in 1997. I was working for Greenpeace Pacific at the time and gave a briefing to the then Prime Minister of Tuvalu about climate change. And he liked it and said, well, will you come on the delegation to Kyoto, which was that was COP3 in 1997. So I was part of the Tuvalu delegation. And then the next year, I basically left Greenpeace and started working for the Tuvalu government and have done so right up till 2019. And it basically, I've been attending most of the COPs since then and all the sort of subsidiary body meetings which are held each year around June in Bonn. So I've been attending those sorts of meetings. Of course, it's, following the Kyoto Protocol, the development of what was called the Marrakesh Accords, the rules for that. In fact, when I first started with the Tuvalu government, I thought Tuvalu was a member of the G77, the group of developing countries, but we weren't. So I started attending G77 meetings, and at one stage I even became the coordinator for G77 on land use and forestry issues under the Kyoto Protocol. And then finally somebody tapped me on the shoulder and said, well, actually Tuvalu is not a member of G77, so can you please leave? So that was a bit embarrassing for me. But so, there's been lots of ups and downs in this whole COP process. I think the most notable one was Copenhagen, COP9, where basically, we had very strong expectations. We were going to land a new agreement on climate change, additional to Kyoto Protocol. It brought on board all countries, and we'd been working in the lead up to Copenhagen with that. And in fact, 6 countries presented draft texts of what was required for a new agreement. One of those we had done as Tuvalu had presented a draft text. So we expected that there would be a reasonable dialogue to look at those texts, to bring on board all countries to do more effort, because, for Tuvalu's sake, Tuvalu is a small coral atoll nation of 11,000 people. Its highest point above sea level is only 4 meters. So it's extremely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And it's already suffering those impacts now. The cyclones are getting more severe, storm surges are getting more severe, and some of these storm surges wash right across the island, and that kills the crops, contaminates the water, etc. So there's a real urgent need to deal with climate change. So when we arrived in Copenhagen, we really had an expectation that there was going to be a reasonable consideration of a new agreement. But at the time, President Obama had convinced the Prime Minister of Denmark that this was not going to happen, unbeknownst to us. And so when we got to a sort of accepting the agenda for the meeting, the then sort of chair of the meeting, Connie Hedegaard from Denmark, basically said, we won't have a proper discussion of these proposals for new agreements. So I had to intervene and say, well, I'm sorry, but this is on the agenda. We want a proper discussion, and basically called for a halt to the meeting until there was a proper consideration of those issues. Of course, at the end of the meeting, we were basically landed with this Copenhagen Accord. The Prime Minister of Tuvalu was there, but he was never engaged in that discussion of that Copenhagen Accord at all. And he had to leave the day before it was presented. And so I worked with him the night before to work out our red lines about what was acceptable in this accord, noting, in fact, that it wasn't going to lead to a legally binding agreement. And one of those was the concern about, a reference to 1.5 degrees Celsius, because this was a critical temperature limit that the IPCC had said would be, sort of the area where Tuvalu may survive or not. This came out in one of their graphs, which is classically known as the burning embers graph in one of their earlier reports. I think it was their third assessment report or fourth assessment report. They presented this graph, and it basically showed that, small island states, particularly coral atolls, could be on the brink of not surviving above 1.5 degrees Celsius. So when we saw the Copenhagen Accord in the wee hours of the Saturday morning after the COP was supposed to have finished, there was a reference to 2 degrees, and we that had crossed our red line, and for a vulnerable country, we just couldn't sign off on an agreement that basically spelt the end of Tuvalu. So that's, we had to object, and I knew at the time that as soon as the Prime Minister of Denmark, spoke to this Copenhagen Accord, I had to press the button and intervene and basically stop him from just gaveling it through, getting it accepted. And said, look, I'm sorry, Prime Minister, but we can't accept this. And 5 other countries joined in and said, we can't accept this as well. And so, that caused a lot of concern. We then, broke into little huddles to try and find out a wording of how we could deal with this Copenhagen Accord. And in the end, we just noted it. And so that was, probably the most stressful time in my negotiating career, because, you had to stand up to the likes of President Obama and all other heads of state who'd agreed on this text and say, no, this isn't acceptable to us. So these are the sort of challenges you have as a negotiator. Of course, we went into a bit of a lull after the Copenhagen, and we started to build up momentum again towards agreeing to a new legally binding agreement. We did that in South Africa at the Durban COP, and we started developing the Paris Agreement, as it turned out. And so I was involved as part of the least developed countries group to work on key elements of the Paris Agreement, and it finally came through in the end.
That's great, Ian. I remember in Copenhagen there were examples of the intense pressure that bears down on members of the small island states. I think there were 1 or 2 examples, weren't there, of states that were effectively bought off in terms of their positions?
Yes, I mean, in the lead up to Paris, the Maldives government, the president of the Maldives, had been, making a lot of statements. And in fact, he held an underwater cabinet meeting, in scuba gear to sort of show this is what it's going to be like for a country like Maldives. But in the end, he accepted the Copenhagen Accord, and for the life of me, I couldn't understand why he accepted that. And there were reports that came out in WikiLeaks afterwards that money had changed hands between the US and the Maldives government before Copenhagen. So whether that precipitated that change in view, I'm not sure. But certainly it was disturbing to me that, this champion of climate change was now sort of, had given up.
Would it also be fair to say that the way in which Obama stepped in at the end of Copenhagen and, for the want of a better word, cobbled together these voluntary commitments, in some ways that was quite formative in shaping what eventually took shape leading up to the Paris Agreement? Is that a fair comment?
Well, yes and no. I mean, there were people behind the scenes sort of working on this sort of draft document, and basically he sort of brokered a deal with India and China because there was a small group of leaders had gone into a small room to sort of hammer out this Copenhagen Accord and whether they could agree on an amount of money for it, what commitments all countries would take, etc. And the Chinese and Indian delegates sort of walked out of that meeting, to discuss amongst themselves. And Obama crashed that meeting and got a deal with them and presented that as the sort of outcome. We were effectively given the Copenhagen Accord again at the next COP in Mexico and sort of made to sort of swallow it again. But I guess it set in train a process of, greater reporting from all countries, both developed and developing countries had to report on what they were doing. And this essentially, paved the way, I guess, for the development of the Paris Agreement, where all countries had to take on what we called nationally determined contributions. And even that terminology, nationally determined contribution, was a highly contested word. That they're originally going to be national commitments. And then, India, I think, basically said, no, we want something that's nationally determined. And it can't be commitment. So I think the US objected to the word commitment because it sounded too much like the Kyoto Protocol. And at that stage, the US had pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol, and they didn't want a new agreement that looked too much like the Kyoto Protocol. So it became nationally determined contributions.
And of course, I suppose the legal significance is that the contributions themselves are not legally binding.
Well, this is the issue, whether or not, and this is the game that Obama had to play, because he knew that, he had limited powers through his presidential powers to sign on to a legally binding agreement through his executive powers without it having to go to Congress, and this was the path he had to tread. And so, throughout the negotiations of the Paris Agreement, we were reminded of this fact that, there were limitations to how legally binding it would be. And in fact, in the first contact group in Paris, I was in one on the mitigation talking about these nationally determined contributions, and we had language that was this: prepare and implement was one of the key words, to implement nationally determined contribution, which was a key issue. And the US says we can't live with the word implement because that was basically, them committing to doing something in a legally binding form that Obama felt he could not commit to without it having to go to Congress. So we lost the word implement. So we now prepare and update, but we don't formally commit to it. And there's other language, in the last few minutes of Paris, there was a so-called editorial change to change the word shall to should as far as financial commitments by developed countries. And again, that was at the behest of the United States because it implied a legal obligation to provide finance. But there are other aspects of it that do have legal consequence, and so we had to sort of play this charade that we were not actually developing a treaty under the Vienna Convention on the Law of the Treaties, but a sort of informal agreement to satisfy the audience back home in the United States. But in reality, we were negotiating a legally binding treaty, but we couldn't call it that, and so it became the Paris Agreement, as a sort of a disguised form of a legally binding treaty.
But isn't there a distinction to be drawn between the the reporting commitments, for example, and the actual contributions, the numerical contributions? Isn't there a distinction to be drawn in terms of legal undertakings or enforceability?
Well, I mean, you can pull it apart. You can pull apart the Paris Agreement and decide through looking at the language of the mays, should, and shalls, what forms a sort of legally binding obligation or not. And to this day, we still have these debates around that. I was involved in the negotiation around Article 8 of the Paris Agreement, which relates to loss and damage. And in fact, the Prime Minister of Tuvalu met with Senator Kerry, who was Secretary of the State at the time, twice in bilateral meetings. And the French knew that, if Tuvalu and the United States could agree on language around Article 8, then that it would go through. And we only had one contact group, one negotiation with all parties on Article 8 in Paris. And to their wisdom, the French knew that this had to be done, by a select number of countries to get it through. And of course, we had to fight against the US. They applied a sort of three-pronged approach to get rid of loss and damage. First they said it doesn't belong in a legally binding agreement in the Paris Agreement. And we had meetings. The Prime Minister of Tuvalu and myself and senior officials from the White House had meetings in New York around this, and they said, we've spoken to President Obama, and he said, this looks like liability and compensation to me, and so we can't live with that. So they said, no, it doesn't have a place in the Paris Agreement. And because we'd worked hard with a group of 77 countries, we had a unified position in supporting loss and damage. And so the United States tried the second prong of their attack and basically said, let's fold this into the article relating to adaptation. And so this was, to create confusion around what is loss and damage. Is it just building your resilience to the impacts of climate change? So they hope to do that. And again, G77 said, no, we want a separate agreement. So after these bilaterals between the Prime Minister of Tuvalu and Senator Kerry, we were called into a small room. I think there were 3 representatives from LDCs, there were 3 representatives from small island developing states, and there were 5 representatives from the United States. And we just sat there, and there was a French observer there, and we just sat there and worked through the text of Article 8, and finally reached an agreement on what the wording would be, on the proviso that there would be a clause within the decision text, not within the agreement itself, that would limit liability and compensation. So that was the deal struck between Senator Kerry and the Prime Minister of Tuvalu. You can have a separate Article 8 under the Paris Agreement, but there had to be a provision within the decision text that limits liability and compensation. So, I was quite surprised by that because I thought that would have to go into the Paris Agreement itself. But to the credit of the Prime Minister Tuvalu, he managed to get that into the decision text, which doesn't have the same legal standing as a formal treaty. So, and we worked carefully on that liability clause, and I've had lots of discussions with lawyers after that. I think it's paragraph 51 of the 1CP21 text as to what it means and what it delivers. And I have certain views on that, and I think in reality we've got a whole new concept brought into this agreement on loss and damage, which is quite critical. And of course, the discussions on loss and damage came out in Glasgow COP as well, and it was again a controversial issue.
And of course, it has been deferred or handed over, I think, to further conversations from Glasgow. There wasn't a great deal of progress. Was there any straws in the wind in terms of progress or direction of travel?
We got an agreement to a Santiago network on loss and damage, which is basically, a facilitative network for institutions that have some expertise in this area to get together and discuss it. And we've got a sort of work program to look at this issue further. In the second week of the COP, some developing countries put forward the idea of a new financial mechanism or a finance facility for loss and damage. In my view, it wasn't a well presented argument. Of course, we need this. The countries like Tuvalu are already suffering huge losses and damage as a consequence of climate change, and there's no fund or facility for us to get any sort of ability to rebuild after those. We're playing around with insurance arrangements, but that's only a small part of the picture. So we definitely need some sort of fund to support countries who are badly hit by the impacts of climate change. So we've sort of opened the door to a dialogue on this process, and we've just got to do our homework to make sure that it comes forward. And we've got to think about what are the innovative ways of getting that fund up. Could it be a tax on fossil fuels, or could it be some other measure, like a Tobin tax on international transactions? These are the sort of things we have to think through.
Yeah, no, certainly it's one of the most interesting innovations, I think, in the agreement, very far-reaching, if you can give it substance. It really brings us up to Glasgow and COP26, and one of the things that strikes me whenever the media are reporting on the COP, and it has taken on, of course, a new visibility in the media because of the urgency and post-Paris. But I wonder if you could give us a more nuanced description of what COP26 was about in terms of the process and the multiple nature of the conferences that are taking place alongside each other, and then of course the associated activity, the side events and civil society activity. There's a whole array of activity, but a relatively limited number of people are involved in the negotiations, of course, at the heart of these processes.
Yes, well, there were almost 40,000 people attended the COP, and not all of those people are sort of involved in the negotiation. So this is the whole sort of parallel meetings, as you say, going on at the same time. For some of us, we're looking at the three treaties that we have: the Climate Convention, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement. And each one of those treaties has an agenda to advance the work of those treaties. So we have to agree on that agenda and advance those issues. And critically for Glasgow, we had to finish the rule book, what was called the rule book for the Paris Agreement. And there were three key elements to that. And it was basically the carbon markets, which is Article 6, the reporting measures, which is Article 13, and what was called common timeframes to bring in step all countries to report on a regular basis. So that's the sort of negotiations of the critical sort of Paris Agreement rulebook. And I was actively involved in the carbon market issue. So you've got that negotiation going on. Then you've also got what's called the cover decision, the overarching decision that the COP president delivers as the sort of key framing of how they wish to advance the agenda. And that's another set of negotiations, intense negotiations around the wording of that. So there's that process where there are other agenda items on capacity building, indigenous peoples, on finance issues, technology transfer, adaptation. All these agenda items that fit within these three legally binding agreements are carried out. So, for the least developed countries, we meet a week before the start of the COP. We allocate spokespeople to cover each of the agenda items because, as a party, we just can't cover everything. So we allocate spokespeople, we discuss the issues, we go into breakout rooms and discuss, what are the core elements, the red lines for the least developed countries. So I was involved with that. I was a spokesperson for the least developed countries on Article 6, the carbon market. So you've got that sort of rules discussion, and they're in small rooms. Of course, in Glasgow, you also had the Leaders Summit. So all the heads of state came, a large number of heads of state came to the COP and made, speeches. They met amongst themselves. They made various pledges. And so this is a sort of non-formal process of the COP where you're getting heads of state coming together and making pledges to do things. And so there were a number of pledges made at the COP, and I can return to those, as we get on with this conversation. And then we've got, as you say, these side events. So you've got a whole, it's like a fair, a convention where you've got stalls, you've got industry groups, International Emissions Trading Association, aviation associations, various NGOs have all got a sort of stall and are holding meetings, having guest speakers talk, podcasts, online meetings and things like that going on at the same time. We're involved in negotiations. And I don't get to see any of those because they're being held in parallel with the actual negotiations that we're holding. And of course, outside the venue, there are NGO protests, all sorts of events outside the venue as well. So there's a lot going on. Plus, there's a huge media presence there as well. Because there are world leaders there, there are not only world leaders, there are famous movie stars, there are corporate moguls wandering around the room. And of course, the media are interested in those people. So there's a mad scramble to get interviews and things like that. So there's a lot going on in these COPs.
So what I wanted to begin with a kind of a generic question, really, about you occupy the role of an insider, but you're closely associated with the most ambitious parties, if you like. Often the small island states, the least developed countries, are described as the conscience of the process. So the question I want to put to you is this: with the growing urgency and popular awareness driven by media attention and the role of Greta Thunberg and civil society, there seems to be a growing disconnect between what the negotiating system is delivering, and there's a kind of an incrementalism, a built-in momentum, and there's a gap between that and the public expectation. And there's a risk sometimes in some of the NGO responses to the COP that they almost are suggesting that we need to walk away from the process. There's a loss of confidence, a certain amount of skepticism. How do you address that as somebody who's equally, if not more, ambitious than the NGOs, who's involved in the heart of the beast, if you like, that's really moving at a pace that may fail us in terms of the most ambitious elements of the Paris Agreement?
This is the real challenge. When you go into these negotiations, you have high expectations that the world is going to progress on these issues, and we could clearly see there were key points in time that we needed to see achievements as far as getting us on the path to a 1.5 degrees Celsius maximum temperature range. But the challenge is, and of course it's the reason I stay in this process, is that you've got all the countries in the world meeting together, and there's no other process in the world that you can do that. Of course, we work on the basis of consensus, and this often drives us down to the lowest common denominator, and that's a challenge for us. So obviously, we would like a lot more, but you've got countries who have major economic interests in exporting oil, exporting coal, and the world's economy runs on these fossil fuels at the moment. We're changing. We're definitely changing, and the progress is incremental, and people get frustrated that it is incremental, but it's the only way we can get all countries in the world to commit to a common cause, and it's a challenge. We have to drag countries screaming to the negotiating table and accept that change is there and it has to be made. And for small island states, it's not quick enough. Obviously, we like a lot more, but we work in this multilateral global system, and we have to play by those rules. We try and endeavour to get sort of side agreements, and this is what some of these sort of pledges were. There was a methane pledge to reduce methane by 30% by 2030, I think it is. So that was a small group of countries, or a group of countries, making that pledge outside the formal UN process. So you can chip away at different places, but nevertheless, you've got to try and bring on board everybody into this agreement. And the critical thing for highly vulnerable countries is we're affected the most, and therefore we need financial support. And the only way to do that is from the international community, and put pressure on the major polluters to pay for that, for the costs that we're suffering. And you can only do that through a multilateral process like we have. So that there are pros and cons of this process. It is slow, but it does mean we get everybody on board. I've often discussed this with students about should we have voting in the climate convention, and of course if we did, we might get some more progressive positions coming forward, and the recalcitrant countries would be left behind. But the problem is those recalcitrant countries are the ones where we want the most action to take place. So if they vote against a position, they won't feel bound by a decision that it's not in their interests. And so we've just got to bring them on board somehow, and provide opportunities for them to make a contribution. And this was a critical issue we had in the carbon markets agreement, trying to get on board some of these oil exporting countries who had no interest in the carbon market, no interest in making commitments to reduce their own emissions, and trying to accommodate them while ensuring that we had something that would deliver perhaps a system to drive down emissions.
There is a sense in which the UN, because of its near universal participation and that consensus-based approach, which does drive you towards the lowest common denominator, there's a sense in which that the nature of that universality allows some of the recalcitrant countries to hide their positions and hide the ways in which they're manipulating the lowering and putting the brake on ambition. Are there other important multilateral fora that are emerging as critical spaces where real progress has to be driven? I'm thinking of G20, for example.
Yeah, so there are other political processes where climate change is on the agenda, and certainly G20 is one of those where you've got sort of the major economies of the world getting together to agree on that. But they produce declarations; they're not legally binding, and so they have a value in sort of highlighting issues and bringing countries together. And a lot of discussions take place outside the formal process, where they have bilateral meetings with certain countries to work out sort of agreements. And there are a variety of those. The OECD has their own sort of processes, and so there are a variety of you know uh, international processes that sort of discuss the climate agenda, but most of those don't have legally binding consequences.
Okay, so if I was to ask you about the achievements of COP26. I know you've named one or two already. Where was progress made? Where did you feel that there was some attempt to really shift the pace of progress? Where there were some breakthroughs, and where were the biggest disappointments for you?
Well, we did agree on the rule book, and particularly, the carbon market, the reporting requirements, and the common timeframes. Those sort of the final pieces in the jigsaw were put together. I mean, there were major compromises in those agreements. So, for instance, in the carbon market, Brazil were insisting on including Kyoto Protocol credits, pre 2020 credits, to be brought into the carbon market, and they won the day on that. And that's quite disappointing because it sort of undermines the new market mechanism we've established, and is going to have consequences for that. And so these are the compromises you make. I think there were other significant pledges that were made. You'll notice that, in the last few minutes of the COP, we were working on a final umbrella decision talking about the phase out of coal. And China and India, insisted that or said we couldn't live with those words. And we ended up with the wording, phase down of unabated coal power. But in the meantime, on the sidelines, South Africa had brokered a deal for of $8.3 billion for just transition away from coal. So they, while China and India were worrying about wording in the final decision, here we have South Africa, a major, developing country economy that obviously needs to produce power for its population, was brokering this deal with other countries, to the extent of about 8.3 billion. So, that was a major sort of, undertaking for South Africa to do that. And there were sort of other pledges that came out of this. Forests. I think there was about a $15 billion a sum of money pledged for forests, part of that going specifically to indigenous peoples and local communities to support funding for them to have better tenure of their land. So, these are some of the deals. There was also another interesting one, which was called I'm trying to think of what it was. It was a banking, the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero. So this was over 80 major financial institutions getting together to form an alliance to commit to net zero. And these are the sort of big banks around the world committing to a net zero target. that I think is quite significant, and it shows that the UN process does push these other initiatives along, and I think that's the critical aspect of it. Whether they'll meet that net zero target remains to be seen, but it's certainly showing that the financial institutions are responding to shareholders and to the public to say you can't be just going business as usual, and working on a fossil fuel global economy. Things have got to change, and so I think just that formation of that alliance was quite significant. There were other ones around, green shipping. There were things around zero emission cars, and various other sort of initiatives that sort of came through in the sidelines of the UN process. But these things don't happen unless you've got a major conference like we had in Glasgow, and you have a major initiative at the UN level, sort of pushing everybody to do something. So they complement each other. So I think
Yeah, yeah.
that those were the sort of side outcomes that were quite important. There was within the COP process, some additional commitments to finance, but I think in the negotiation process, the major outcomes were really the Paris Agreement rulebook outcomes.
I think you're right about the participation of the financial industry will be pivotal, and it's one that really needs a lot more visibility, I think, and maybe attention from civil society. The South Africa deal was interesting because it 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 leaned towards the notion of climate justice, the just transition, because there was even provision in the deal for retraining workers and involving the trade unions. So that was very interesting. If you were to imagine, uh, I suppose the Paris Agreement working effectively, it would be that kind of template where you're beginning to address some of the consequences for workers who are inevitably going to be having to find jobs in new industries as we begin to close down the polluting industries. So it was a very interesting example of that.
Yes, and it was, and it's a showcase for the rest of the world. Here in Australia, the current government struggles with that issue. There are lots of coal mines here in Australia, and there's very little attempt to try and find this, so-called just transition to move the coal workers, the coal mining workers out of that industry and into something else. I mean, there are small initiatives, some local government organisations are doing work around those areas, but there's no national initiative to do that. So we're quite behind the game here in Australia on that issue.
Yeah. Can I just return to those closing moments when I think it was China and India did change the wording, which will limit action to the most polluting of the coal plants. Um, and if I'm not mistaken, the language is consistent with what was agreed at the G20 as well. Is that right? Um, that intervention seemed to take the UK presidency by surprise. Was it a bit of a dirty play at the end of the process when everything else had been pocketed, and they knew that there couldn't, at that stage, they knew that they weren't going to, well, they could get away with rolling back on on language that I feel that the UK presidency had been agreed. Do you know the background to that story or what was happening?
No, I mean, it not exactly. We don't know how that really played out. Whether it was that they'd gone back to capital and capital had said we can't live with this language, and they brought that on at the last minute. It's interesting to really look at the language there as well. They talk about unabated a phase down of unabated coal power. The term unabated came from the United States, and I think it came through from the G20 meeting. And the term unabated basically gives the nod to carbon capture and storage technology. So if you've got coal-fired power stations where you can capture the carbon and store it, then that's okay. Of course, there's no viable carbon capture and storage system in the world at the moment. But it does sort of say, well, you can still use coal-fired power if it's got carbon capture and storage. And the other one was, the language inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, a phase out to eliminate inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. And again, the word inefficient, I think, came from the G20 summit at the behest of the United States. And that's a nonsense. I mean, is an efficient fossil fuel subsidy acceptable? Does it, if it works really well, as a subsidy, do we think that's acceptable? I mean, it's a nonsense term, and it's again these sort of wiggle words, slippery words to sort of reduce the obligations on countries. So, there's probably a bank of US lawyers, trying to find these sorts of wordings to squeeze out of it. And while Biden was sort of presenting himself as the new savior on climate change, there was these, escape clauses that his delegation were bringing into the negotiations.
I was going to ask you about the UK presidency. There's an interesting dynamic around hosting these events. It can often help the capital mobilize their own population. There's certainly there's added visibility to the issue. It's certainly an opportunity for NGOs on the ground to gain traction for their own climate change activism. And in Northern Ireland, for example, there's a couple of climate change bills going through the Assembly. So there was a lot of debate about which bill might make it through the process. What did you make of the UK presidency? Was it in any way compromised by the equivocation of Boris Johnson's regime around the prospect of a new, I guess, a new gas field in the North Sea, and even the opening of a new mine in England?
Well, people were certainly aware of that, and certainly there were while Boris Johnson was making these pronouncements about Glasgow being the pivotal time for us to take climate action, people knew that domestically he had a different agenda completely. Opening up, as you say, these new gas fields and mines. So I mean that played on people's minds, of course. And I don't think Boris Johnson understood the COP process very well. The fact that he called this sort of leaders summit, it just seemed like, a way of him getting together his big mates in the world and sort of big noting himself without understanding the sort of the nitty gritty of the negotiation process. And that probably led to these sort of grand pledges that were made in the margins of it. But I think they didn't play a very good hand in negotiating the outcome very well. As you say, they didn't anticipate this objection by China and India very well. Of course, this played right down to the wire, and it's always a trap that if you've got a negotiation that goes right down and beyond the time that the meeting is supposed to close, countries can bring forward last minute changes, and this seems to become a norm that we have these sort of last minute changes in the process, and it's hard to anticipate those. In the Madrid COP, the COP25, at the last minute, Brazil objected to the decision on carbon markets because they didn't get what they wanted as far as carryover of units, so that was pushed aside. And so these are the challenges of being hosting a COP that you have high ambition and things fall apart at times. It's
Yes.
interesting to note that the next two COPs will be held in the Middle East. So I suspect we can't be expecting a lot coming out of the next two COPs.
Yeah, I think the next one's in Egypt. Is that
Egypt
correct?
and then United
Yeah.
Arab Emirates. So
Oh my goodness, right. Interesting. Tell me, it would be remiss not to talk about China's role, and obviously China played a role in the closing minutes. You might say reverting to type, but Biden had a bilateral with China, I think, after COP26, and there did appear to be a revisiting of that quite decisive bilateral commitment by China and the US to underpin future progress in the UN process. Did you take heart from the bilateral between the presidents of China and the US after COP26? And do you think we will benefit from that bilateral agreement that also unleashed some of the I suppose the political momentum leading up to Paris?
it's an interesting one to ponder. I mean, this is, uh, you know, at, uh, at the international level, they're antagonistic towards each other. Militarization has never been as great as it is now, and yet they're agreeing on this sort of. Well, they did sign a U.S.-China joint Glasgow declaration on enhancing climate action there at the meeting, and I mean, it doesn't have a lot of substance to it. They did make some pledges around methane and exploring actions for sort of green design and renewable sources of and utilization. There's not a lot of specifics to it, but it does signal that these two major the world's biggest polluters, I guess, are getting together and trying to find a way of collaboration. So I think it was quite significant that they did that. I mean, of course, this the substance is the critical issue, and whether it will deliver collaboration and cooperation between those countries to move away from fossil fuels remains to be seen.
I'd like to close. And you're working with students now in your own university, and I think there's a growing certainly the university here at Queen's, and I know you've been to visit us because I know you have an interest in what we're doing here at Queen's, and you have ties to this part of the world as well. Um, there's a growing interest across the university in interesting and engaging students on these issues. Where would you say the key skills will be, or that are required to effect change and to make a meaningful contribution to these issues in a law school? Where would you say we should be concentrating on, in promoting and enabling students to really engage effectively in these issues?
Yeah, well, I mean that's a challenge. In one of my courses, which is international environmental policy, I run a negotiation, a simulation, and I've seen lots of other simulations that take place through the UN, and they're more like debating society discussions. They're not a real simulation. So I give students a brief. They've got to negotiate. They've got to make a statement of their country position and go into contact group, and we negotiate word for word. And they're pretty surprised by the nature of that sort of negotiation. It's not a sort of friendly, oh, my view is this, and we welcome your view. We're negotiating word for word, and crucially in negotiations, that's where lawyers really come out. I have a number of lawyers in my course, and you can tell their analysis of words, the implications of words, are critical in this sort of process, and they usually stand out in that process. So there's that part of it as well. But there are a lot of other legal processes that are going on that are driving climate agenda. So you've got a lot of litigation developing. I've had students involved with the Environmental Defenders Office, which is a sort of NGO that does a lot of litigation here in Australia, and that's critical to get that sort of experience of litigation. I also have a student who's looking at the whole disclosure part of it. So it's getting corporations to disclose their investments in fossil fuels, and that's quite critical. And I really want to work on that further to really bring about legislative changes to ensure that companies give full disclosure of their investments. And this is really where a lot of change is going to occur. I think shareholders are demanding it, and I think this is where a lot of change will come. Through these disclosure mechanisms and legislation to enforce it.
Yeah, and of course the domestic legislation and the drive to get governments to bind themselves to these commitments has become an important front in this battle as well. And then young people are often in the lead with these attempts to get governments to bind themselves, as we saw in the Netherlands.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And the same is happening here. We're getting Indigenous peoples groups, running cases with the Human Rights Commission. We've got, cases of people opposing coal mines here in Australia as well. And so getting that experience, participating in those legislative processes, as well as developing legislation is quite critical.
Okay, that's great, Ian. And where would you be for the next COP? There's 12 months leading up to the next COP. What would you like to see happen over the next year in terms of civil society focus on getting a good result? I know that there was a decision to keep pressure on countries to improve their nationally determined contributions next year. Where would civil society need to focus between now and the next COP to really increase the momentum and getting near that 1.5 degree temperature goal?
Well, I think there has to be greater pressure put on the UK government. I mean, they came out not looking, fantastic after the COP because of the processes. They have 12 months of their presidency to run, and so they've got to deliver some real outcomes. And so they've got to drive the agenda to more commitments. And we've got to see this sort of 2030 agenda, where countries are clearly putting in revised targets. I mean, it's easy for countries to make, net zero targets by 2050 because no politician will be alive today to confirm those commitments. But certainly, nearer term commitments are critical to get us on this 1.5 path. So that there's a lot of pressure needed to be put onto the governments, but also corporations to do that. To deliver the necessary commitments to reduce their reliance on fossil fuels. And the renewable energy and energy efficiency world is well advanced in a lot of this work. It's just a matter of getting some of these major corporations and governments to sort of get off the track of fossil fuels and make new commitments. I mean, for small island states, I had a meeting with Pacific High Commissions here in Canberra. One of the issues for us is the ocean agenda that's coming up. We've got a sort of ongoing dialogue on oceans, and this is a critical issue. Climate change is affecting the oceans, particularly in the South Pacific. It's changing tuna stocks. The populations of tuna are migrating away from warmer waters. That's going to affect the economies of a lot of Pacific Island countries substantially, as well as direct impacts of more severe cyclones. So we've got to also ramp up our efforts to bring home the attention of those critical issues as well.
Yeah, I think just to close, you're alluding, I suppose, to the need always not to look at climate change in isolation from the other, not only the impacts directly related to climate change, but the multiple ecological crises around species loss and land use change. There's, I suppose, there's a risk in focusing even too much on climate change to the exclusion of the system change that needs to happen around core economic trajectories.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
the way we measure wealth and the way we measure prosperity and move away from GDP, these are important debates that come into the mix as well, aren't they?
Certainly, and we have to rethink our, economic system around those and value these resources much better. I've got a meeting next week with online meeting with Papua New Guinea politicians, to talk about, the Glasgow meeting, what it meant for the tropical forests of Papua New Guinea, and that's a real challenge. Hugely biodiverse region of the world, and what can be done to protect those forests. And there are major economic influences driving deforestation in Papua New Guinea that are beyond what a climate convention can do. But we have to address those issues as well.
That's great, Ian. Thank you so much for taking the time. That's been a fascinating journey through your own participation and an explanation, a real insight into the negotiating process. And so, thank you so much for taking the time. And it's great to see you again.
Yes,
and,
thank you very much. And I'll have to come
we'll
and
catch up.
visit my distant relatives. Who
Where are they from again? Did you say Fermanagh?
Fermanagh, yes. So my great grandfather, I think, came from Fermanagh. He came out to Australia as a policeman, and so yes, so I trace back to that region of Northern Ireland, which I only got a glimpse of last time I was there. So I've got to come back for sure.
Great. Well, we look forward to welcoming you back to Queen's University as well. Thank you so much, Ian. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.